There's a loophole buried inside the FIA's 2026 regulations that no one was supposed to find. Except, Mercedes already did. And what they've built around it might not just give them an edge, it could force the FIA to rewrite the rules mid-season. According to internal simulations, if this loophole performs under race conditions the way Mercedes expects, it could reset the entire grid hierarchy, catching Ferrari, Honda, and even Red Bull completely off guard. Later in this video, we'll reveal the exact section of the rulebook Mercedes is quietly exploiting, and why several team principals are already demanding an emergency clarification before preseason even begins. If you've followed F1 long enough to know the real championships are won in boardrooms, not on Sundays, you'll want to see why this might be Mercedes' most important innovation since the turbo-hybrid era began. The FIA's 2026 regulation package was meant to be the great equalizer. Lighter power units, 50% electrical power output, and a strong focus on sustainability were supposed to reset the technical race, closing the gap between manufacturers and handing every team a new, clean sheet. That was the official promise. What no one said, at least not publicly, is that buried inside that 130-page document are regulatory fractures, places where wording, intent, and physics don't perfectly align. And in one of those fractures, Mercedes may have quietly built a launch pad. According to the FIA's official language, teams must adhere to a strict balance between MGUK deployment and fuel flow, especially during acceleration events. This rule was introduced to prevent overcompensation by internal combustion systems and to ensure the new era favors hybrid performance over raw fuel-based output. It was intended to slow development races and encourage efficiency-driven design. But Mercedes appears to have read this rule through a different lens, one that focuses not on what's forbidden, but on what's left unsaid about pre-acceleration conditions. And that's where things start to unravel. The rule in question, section 5.4.3 of the Power Unit Technical Regulations, defines how much electric power can be deployed during and after throttle application. But it says nothing about what happens before throttle engagement, specifically, during the microseconds where load begins to transfer. But input hasn't technically been registered. To most teams, this window is irrelevant. To Mercedes, it might be an opening. And the FIA, at least for now, has not issued any clarification that would close it. Officially, no team has broken the rules. No technical directives have been released. But since October, several manufacturers including Honda and Ferrari have submitted private requests for clarification on what constitutes driver input under dynamic acceleration conditions. That's not a protest. That's a warning sign. And when those requests happen in silence, it usually means one team is already building something that others don't understand. Mercedes hasn't confirmed anything. They haven't mentioned a new deployment system. But in mid-November, their test facility requested a rare extension on dyno testing hours, an exception the FIA granted with zero public explanation. Shortly after, an anonymous engineer connected to a Tier 2 supplier leaked that Mercedes had been testing power redistribution under non-input conditions, language that perfectly matches the ambiguity in section 5.4.3. That's not a coincidence. That's a strategy. One designed to stay legal by exploiting how slowly the rules adapt to new interpretations. In a championship where every watt counts, Mercedes may have engineered a system that delivers preemptive energy buildup using chassis motion, sensor fusion, and even steering angle telemetry to predict throttle input milliseconds before it occurs. If true, it means the car begins deploying before the driver fully commits. Legally. Because the driver's foot hasn't moved yet. And under the current regulations, that window remains undefined. No violation. No trigger. Just a mechanical consequence of how the system interprets motion. A consequence no other team was expecting. What makes this especially dangerous is the timing. If Mercedes arrives in Bahrain with this system in place, and it isn't explicitly outlawed before then, they will have a legal, performance-enhancing deployment advantage, one that other teams can't challenge without admitting they overlooked a loophole hiding in plain sight. And for the FIA, that poses a dilemma. Do they intervene before seeing the system? Or do they wait, risking a repeat of 2014, when Mercedes' power unit gave them a season-long head start no one could close? Coming up next, the first concrete signs of what this system actually does, and why rival teams are panicking behind closed doors. Behind closed doors, engineers have started referring to it as the preload deployment window. It's not an official name, and Mercedes hasn't confirmed its existence. But across at least 3 rival teams, technical departments are now running emergency simulations to test whether such a system is even possible. And more importantly, whether it could be legal. Because what Mercedes may have identified isn't just a loophole in the rulebook. It's a blind spot in real-time enforcement. One that could give them a mechanical and electrical head start in every traction zone of the 2026 calendar. Here's how it's believed to work. The 2026 regulations tightly define when and how the MGUK can deploy power. But what they don't define, at least not in enforceable terms, is the microphase where the car's inertia shifts forward, weight transfers, and kinetic sensors begin to react, before throttle is technically applied. This moment lasts just milliseconds. It's invisible in real time. But if you build a system that's able to read steering angle, vertical chassis motion, and brake release position together, you can begin calculating the probability of throttle input before it occurs. And that's where the window opens. According to rumors from within the supplier network, Mercedes has developed a predictive model that links these parameters using AI-trained behavior loops, calibrated to driver style and circuit geometry. It doesn't require GPS. It doesn't rely on direct throttle position. Instead, it recognizes driver intention and uses that as a legal basis for preemptive energy deployment. So technically, no rules are broken. The car merely understands when acceleration is coming faster than the rules define it. And since the FIA hasn't yet set enforcement protocols for pre-input deployment logic, there's no immediate basis for protest. This is where things become unsettling for the competition. Because if Mercedes can legally deploy 20 to 30 additional kilowatts of power a fraction of a second earlier than their rivals, they're gaining several meters of advantage in every acceleration zone without touching the rulebook. It's not magic. It's math. By leveraging the unregulated edge of human-machine behavior, they may have shifted the entire timing structure of power delivery in their favor. And in a sport where hundredths of a second define overtaking windows, that's a season-changing advantage. Teams like Red Bull and Ferrari are reportedly furious not because the system is illegal, but because they missed it. They spent the winter optimizing combustion ratios, turbo lag recovery, and energy harvesting efficiency. But they didn't think to ask what happens before the system wakes up. Now, Mercedes might be entering 2026 with a car that begins moving before the competition even reacts. And as one engineer put it, they're not breaking the rules, they're just ahead of the curve that governs them. The FIA's silence is starting to feel like strategy or paralysis. They haven't denied the system exists. They haven't issued a directive to limit behavior-based deployment timing. And that might be because they don't yet understand the full implications themselves. How do you regulate intent? How do you measure a predictive model? And if the system isn't controlled by the driver or by external triggers, but by statistical likelihood, does it even qualify as activation? These are questions no one at the FIA has had to answer before. And Mercedes knows it. And yet, this is only part of the picture. Because according to one source close to the Mercedes simulation team, this preload system may not just be about deployment. It may be influencing how the car handles tire load, torque ramp, and even gear shifting timing, creating an entire behavioral map that executes milliseconds ahead of everyone else. And if that's true, the real danger isn't what the system does now. It's what it sets in motion. Next, we'll dive into why this isn't just a clever idea, but a foundational shift in how Mercedes is designing the entire 2026 car. The key twist isn't that Mercedes found a clever advantage. It's that they may have built an entire car around what the FIA forgot to define. That distinction matters, because Formula One has always lived by a delicate balance. Teams push the edge of performance, and the FIA pushes back with enforcement. But in 2026, that balance is under threat because Mercedes may have exploited something far more powerful than horsepower. They've exposed the limits of regulatory imagination. And in doing so, they've created a car that doesn't just anticipate the rules. It functions ahead of them. Clause 5.4.3 was supposed to limit energy deployment. Instead, it may have created a new frontier of interpretation. When does driver input begin? Is it the foot on the pedal? The release of the brake? The moment the chassis starts to move? The problem is, none of these definitions exist in the rulebook with technical specificity. And Mercedes might be the first team to weaponize that absence. Not with active systems, not with banned tech, but by building something that appears inevitable. Because if the car reacts before the driver consciously acts, can it be called illegal? This is where the FIA's authority starts to crack. Because every attempt to clarify a rule after the fact risks validating the loophole it's trying to close. If they release a directive that bans behavior-based deployment, they're acknowledging they didn't anticipate it. If they allow it to stand, they concede that the rules don't fully define input. Either way, Mercedes wins the regulatory battle long before a race is run. And that kind of win doesn't show up in stopwatch data. It shows up in silence, in the nervous pauses during press conferences, in the briefings that suddenly go off record. That's where the real war is being fought. What makes this twist even more dangerous is how invisible it is. DOS could be photographed. The double diffuser could be diagrammed. Even Ferrari's 2019 fuel flow trick left measurable anomalies. But this system has no singular component. It's an emergent behavior, something that arises from the way dozens of independent systems are tuned to respond to intention, not instruction. There's no one sensor to inspect, no actuator to ban. Just layers of software logic embedded in legal hardware, acting just before the human does. For rival teams, the panic is already setting in. Because this kind of advantage can't be copied quickly. It's not an upgrade, it's a philosophy baked into how the entire vehicle reacts. Recreating it would require not only a new power unit control strategy, but a redesigned driver input mapping system, a fresh approach to chassis dynamics, and months of correlation testing under new FIA restrictions. By the time anyone else catches up, the early season points could already be lost. And Mercedes? They'll have done it all without breaking a single line of the rulebook. There's another layer to this story, one that's even harder to talk about. If Mercedes really has built a car that behaves ahead of driver input, then they've opened the door to a world where machine intuition starts to replace human command. That's not science fiction. That's the next phase of control. And it raises uncomfortable questions. What happens when teams start designing cars that anticipate behavior more accurately than the driver does? What happens when data replaces instinct? The FIA has no language for that. And Mercedes may have just given them a reason to start writing it. So now, the real pressure isn't on Mercedes, it's on the FIA. Because every lap the car runs without protest legitimizes the concept. Every delay in clarification gives Mercedes a deeper legal foothold. And every failure to define this edge hardens the perception that the rules don't protect fairness anymore. They just punish those who weren't fast enough to find the loopholes. Coming up, why this could change the sport for years. And how the FIA's next move may decide more than just a championship. What no one is willing to say out loud, at least not in public, is that the most dangerous part of Mercedes' 2026 concept might not be the performance it delivers, but the precedent it sets. Because if this pre-input deployment system works, and if the FIA doesn't act before the car hits the track, then every other team will have to start designing not just for compliance, but for interpretive advantage. The game shifts from "what does the rule allow?" to "what doesn't the rule forbid?" And in that space, creativity becomes a weapon. One that only a few teams have the infrastructure, culture, and courage to wield. This is the part fans never see. Behind the scenes, regulation isn't just a boundary, it's a battleground. And what Mercedes may have exposed is that the FIA's 2026 framework, praised for its clarity and vision, was never stress-tested against behavioral engineering. It was built to govern power units, batteries, drag coefficients. But not probabilistic deployment windows. Not structural interpretation of input. That's a frontier no one planned for. And now that Mercedes has walked into it, the entire system of technical policing may be obsolete before the first race. There's a deeper issue here, one that goes beyond lap times. If this system is real, and if it holds up under scrutiny, then Mercedes hasn't just exploited the rulebook, they've outpaced the legal language of the sport. The FIA cannot regulate what it hasn't defined. And as of today, there is no clear definition for anticipatory deployment. No test procedure for intention-based acceleration. Which means Mercedes is building performance in a legal vacuum, one that might not be illegal, but is certainly unchallenged. That legal gray zone is where dynasties begin, and where institutions start to lose control. And this isn't happening in isolation. Multiple sources have confirmed that other teams, most notably Honda and Ferrari, have already requested quiet meetings with FIA officials to discuss early-stage behavior in ERS systems. Not to protest Mercedes outright, but to understand what's allowed now before it's too late. Because they know that once Mercedes races the system, any attempt to ban it mid-season would be politically toxic and technically difficult. It would trigger appeals, compromise results, and worst of all, confirm that the FIA was caught off guard by the very kind of innovation they're supposed to manage. What no one is saying publicly is how difficult it will be to even prove this system is operating as intended. Because unlike traditional cheats or gray areas, flexi wings, oil burn, or hidden fuel tanks, this mechanism isn't visible at rest. It exists in timing, in probability curves, in preemptive logic baked into legal deployment sequences. There's no single sensor to examine. No part to measure. The behavior emerges from how the systems were taught to think. And that's not something you can spot with a camera or a post-race inspection. It's a behavior that lives in milliseconds. And Mercedes knows those milliseconds are unregulated. What no one at the FIA seems ready to admit is how vulnerable this makes them look. Because if a system can bypass the scrutiny of static testing, If it only activates under race-level dynamic conditions, then the current inspection model scrutineering, dyno analysis, telemetry checks becomes performative, not protective. And the more the FIA waits, the more this illusion becomes visible. The story shifts from Mercedes found an edge to the FIA never saw it coming. And for a governing body that already struggles with perception issues, this could be a fatal blow to credibility. And here's what almost no one wants to explain to the public. This kind of innovation isn't illegal yet. It's just ahead of definition. And in Formula One, that's enough to win titles. If Mercedes has truly moved first into this next phase of regulatory interpretation, then they've created more than a performance advantage. They've created a blueprint. One that can't be banned without rewriting the very logic of the FIA's governance model.